that in. Again, thank you for inviting us, Vanessa. We really appreciate working in partnership with your office. So without further ado, my name is Narce Rodriguez, and Vice President for Student Affairs and also the Chief of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at Pacific University. And I will have Jean introduce herself.
Hello, everybody. Buenos dias. Jean Garcia, she, her, hers, ella pronouns. And I am the director of the Student Multicultural Center, and I split my time with the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Welcome, everyone.
Wonderful. So as Vanessa said, today we're going to be presenting on managing bias as a job candidate. It's very exciting that many of you are about to graduate, or maybe you have a little bit longer to go. But this presentation is really done from the spirit of providing you tools and something that I wish I would have had when I was an undergrad student way back in the day. Kind of went cold turkey into trying to find a job. So thank you again, Vanessa, for inviting us. So let's move to the next page to talk about the learning objectives. So what is it that you're going to walk away with today? Our goal is that you will be able to define bias and microaggression. Some of you probably already may know what this is, but it's always good to be able to kind of brush up on these particular topics. 2 is learn how to recognize bias and microaggressions in a job interview, and what do you do about it? 3 is to determine how your values can help influence your decision in the interview process. And then 4, learn how to harness your power as a job candidate. Really quick quote, can you go back really quick? Is people generally see what they look for and hear what they listen for. So, Jean and I really like quotes, so just wanted to kind of start the day with that. Jean is next.
So what is bias? Bias is a prejudice, either in favor of or against one thing, a person or a group, and it compares with another, usually in a way that's considered unfair. So really, biases may be held by an individual, it might be held by a group, or as an institution, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a couple minutes. And they can have negative or positive consequences. So there's 2 types of biases, and we're going to talk about both of them today. One of them is conscious, and it's also known as explicit, or unconscious, which is known as implicit. And we'll again talk about those 2 specifically in a couple minutes. Next slide. So we have a video that's going to explain a little bit more about these 2 ways that bias happens in the workplace.
Unconscious biases are those impressions that exist in our unconscious mind and unknowingly inform our opinions about people. When we make judgments about people, we all have biases. We are aware of many of them, but sometimes they are completely subconscious and reflect our cultural and social experiences. No matter how unbiased we think we are, these aspects of human nature shape how we interact with people and how we make decisions. They are blind spots in our rational decision-making, and we are unaware that they exist. As one famous psychologist, Daniel Kahneman, said, the brain is a machine for jumping to conclusions. We make judgments within seconds of meeting someone about everything from their competence to friendliness and even honesty. If we do not counter these preconceptions, we can make mistakes that jeopardize our working relationships and hinder teamwork and creativity. We live and work in a diverse society, so we must be aware that our subconscious biases and stereotypes can affect how we think and feel about people we come into contact with.
So the point of this video, I think the big point for me is just remembering that we all have biases. So as we've all grown up in very different homes with different family dynamics. We've grown up in different locations in the country. We've grown up with different media images, or we've grown up with different uncles and aunts, right? That might say different things to us and to each other in front of us. And so all of those things are pieces that create are biases, and we all have them, as the video said. So just keeping that in mind, and remembering that it's not oh, you have a bias and you're a bad person. No, we all have biases, and we will all continue to create those conscious decisions in our minds. And the idea is around this education is to know that that is what is happening, and to be aware that those things are happening. And we're going to talk a little bit later about what to do about some of these biases when they come up. Next slide. So when we're talking about biases, there are a lot of them, too many to count and too many to put into this slideshow. But today we're going to just talk about 8 biases that happen, and knowing what they are, and we're going to give you some examples, and that'll help you recognize what they are. And the idea is, yes, these things happen in everyday life, but we also want y'all to think about them as you are in front of a group of folks in an interview. Why are these questions getting asked of you? Is it a bias? Is it not a bias? So we'll start with the first one. And that is confirmation bias. Confirmation is, as we saw in the video, everyone is quick to pass judgment, right? And we're all guilty of this. You can make a snap decision based on something that you believe to be true. And then you can spend the rest of the time perhaps subconsciously trying to justify that bias. So I'll give you an example, and it's not work related, but it's one that I like to give because it really made me aware of my own confirmation bias. I had gone to go get a haircut at, I think it's like a Great Clips. And I was sitting there waiting. And for those of y'all that might get your haircut there, you know that basically you go in and whoever's next is who you get. And so I had walked in, and there was an older Latino woman cutting hair. She was, I say older, maybe in her 40s. And then there was another younger girl who had tattoos from like her forehead to her toes, like on her hands, arms, everywhere. And she, I'm guessing maybe was in her mid to late 20s, something like that. And so when I walk in, right, like I look at both of these two folks and I'm like, well, I'm thinking I probably don't want the person with the tattoo cutting my hair. You know, she seemed younger, maybe less experienced. And again, this is my bias kicking in, creating all these things in my mind around why she is not as capable of cutting hair. Tattoos all over. And I'm just like, oh yeah. Well, as things often happen, this younger young lady was the one that ended up cutting my hair. And as often we take time to get to know people, I find out later that she is in grad school. She's doing cutting hair because she's a single mom, and she's trying to make ends meet and making sure that she can get through grad school to get a better job. So that really made me think about like my first impressions of folks. And again, just thinking about when you have conversations and you get to know folks a little better, and you start to like go, oh yeah, like checking your own bias. And the really funny thing is I actually have tattoos. So why I have this bias against folks that have a lot, I don't know, but it was in my brain, and it was a really big learning moment for me. So getting back to interviews, I just like to give examples so that we can kind of get on the same page around some of these biases. So really what might happen in an interview is if you come in, someone might have a preconceived notion about you, and they may start asking you questions to try to prove what that bias is that they might have, that they in their mind have created you to be. I hope that makes sense. And as it says here, in fact, 60% of people will make a decision about someone's suitability within 15 minutes of meeting them. So in this example, it talks about being in a search committee and again, looking for similar candidates to those that they had before. So you might come in and you might fit that stereotype that they might have in their brain, or you might not. So just being aware again of questions that they might be asking you, Does it sound like they're pointing towards something or trying to get to something that makes them want to have you fit that mold that they in their minds have created? So that's confirmation bias. And I'll pass it on to Narce for expectation.
Thank you, Jean. So for the expectation anchor bias, again, think about it in general is, Jean and I are presenting this to you. You are being the person that's being interviewed, but you also need to be aware of those that are interviewing you as well, and what biases they may also may be coming for them. So for the expectation anchor bias is when we allow ourselves or to one certain piece of information about a candidate or a student and use it to make us help a decision. One example of that could be, this is when we refuse to believe that anyone other than a carbon copy of the role's predecessor will be successful. So you may be in that situation where you might be competing with that particular situation, or you also may have an assumption or knowledge or information that you are anchoring to. Maybe you had a friend that worked, I'm just making this up, at Nike, and their experience was XYZ. But maybe that's not the situation anymore because a lot of companies go through different transitions. So just kind of be aware of all of those particular situations. For example, if you're interviewing for a position where the previous person was well liked for a particular reason, they will want to hire someone just like them to fill those particular shoes. And that can be a very difficult situation that you might find yourself in. I always share this piece of information. Go in with a mind of saying things such as my transferable skills are the following. So you live room, there's this room or this space of people that might have a bias that might be interviewing, you go, oh, transferable skills, and they align with X, Y, Z. Of course, you're always at a disadvantage not knowing who interviewed before you and how badly they interview or how stellar they interview. So just always go in with your best attitude on that. But the key here is don't anchor yourself by whatever company you might be working with on my friend said that this is a good company or bad or whatever it might be. Go in with really with you and yourself and your tools and the keywords such as transferable and so that would be my advice. Next slide. The halo effect is similar to the expectation, the anchor, the anchoring. It occurs when we forego proper investigation of a student or candidate's background, choosing instead to focus too heavily on one positive aspect and rely on the one thing when making decisions. When you're looking at this, when we're like, you're probably saying, why are you saying investigation of a student or candidate's background? We use this particular presentation, Jean and I, for multiple reasons. So this one in particular, when you see student, is because when a student, when he, she, or they are being interviewed to be part of a cohort of a graduate program, we also, talk to search committees or selecting committees to think about those things. For example, during an interview, if an applicant has a strong education credential, the committee might conclude that they will be successful in this particular position. So one of the things to keep in mind is you are interviewing for a particular position. Make sure that, again, you do your homework about this particular company. You might have the search committee, they might have some biases that come through. And what I mean by that is that maybe, and this happens, I've seen this in my 30 years in my career where people, companies, institutions of higher ed, institutions of health, whatever, my I call it pigeon toe themselves by hiring all University of Oregon graduates. oh, it's, that's a duck or that's a beaver, or that's a whatever, Stanford University, whatever it might be. So make sure that you are aware of those particular situations that might come up. And another thing that also happens is that sometimes a company wants to hire a, like what I call a model minority, which is a stereotype. So if you happen to be a person from a marginalized population, they might stereotype you. So you kind of have to be astute and aware of that as well, where they're like, oh my God, this particular is, and I'm just making this up, right now as I go, I don't mean to stereotype. This person is Asian, API student, API graduated from XYZ Institution Pacific in this case, they're going to be wonderful at math, and maybe they're not, right? So you have to be really astute about also, keeping those things in mind. Is there anything you want to add to this, Jean?
No, I think just really a lot of times there's not anything that you can do about some of these things. The idea is just to be aware that that might be how you're perceived or not perceived in some cases. So just being aware of like example, the college, right? Like making sure that you again are really thorough and you put all of the important information that's necessary for the position that you're applying for, so that way, like if they think maybe a certain college is better than another one, at least if you've written down all of your skills, then they'll be able to see that on paper.
Thank you, Jean. The horn effect is a polar opposite of what we just talked about, the halo. This is when something bad or interesting about the applicant negatively grabs our attention, and we can't move beyond it. We let it cloud our judgment, and more often than not, it impacts the decision. An example of that would be when a rival school for undergrad, or they chew, Jean loves this one, the chewing the gum or clicking the pen during the interview, and it's distracting. So I can tell you myself, I've been in a lot of search committees and have interviewed a lot of different people. And I can see how difficult it might be for the person that's interviewing and then also for the committee. So try to not chew gum, which is kind of common sense. Jean always talks about that. I remember one particular person that we were interviewing, and the person had very long nails and they just kept tapping, on the table, but they were unconscious that they were actually doing that. I myself was interviewing and I just kept scratching my head. I was just itchy and I just couldn't stop it. And I was not aware that I was actually doing that. Unfortunately, sometimes the committees that are interviewing us may not be aware of what all of our characteristics that we bring to the table might be. You might be the first person in your family, first generation that's interviewing for a position that is, just like in a very impressive position. And the people that might be interviewing you may not have any experience with first generation, or they might be very privileged people that are interviewing you. They may be towards your advantage or towards your disadvantage. So just wanted to put that out there as well.
And I just want to make a point. Yeah, just being ready for the interview, right? Like, I know that's easier said than done, but practice with your friends, video yourself, right? Like if Nisa had videoed herself before she went to that interview 25 years ago, she would have seen that she was scratching her head, right? So some of these things, like she said, are unconscious, and these might be things that we might be doing because we're nervous, or it just might be something that we do. So think about ways that you can look at yourself in that interview space. Like what are you doing? How do people see you? I always say, like, practice what you're going to wear. Like don't just suddenly get up in the morning and go, oh yeah, I'm going to wear X. And then you put it on and it's like, oh yeah, there's like a big old stain on it. Or, these are like common sense, but like, I think sometimes when we get nervous, we don't think about it and we don't plan ahead. And interviews are super important, as y'all know. So planning ahead to be the very best that you can on that day is really important.
Thank you, Jean. The similarity attraction bias, we're human. So our human nature is to want to surround ourselves with people we feel we have a connection with at work, at school, at a job, at a future job that we might have. So similar traits or characteristics to us, even when those things aren't correlated with the criteria, may grab our attention and be the only aspect of the applicant that we focused on. So this is really important for you to be a student focus on while you're being interviewed. And search committees have the ability to be able to do a follow-up question, right? And I'm sure that you probably already attended other workshops um, that will probably talk more in detail about what a search committee can ask you and not ask you legally, but sometimes similarity attractions can happen. Also, you also need to be careful that while you're being interviewed, there's a person that you're like, oh my gosh, that lady is wearing, or whatever, or that guy or that person is wearing, whatever it might be that you like a brand name. So try to not have that particular bias because we're always looking for that similarity attraction that happens. An example is when the search committee members may emphasize rationale that supports the decision they've made in the past. Like the three of us are from, so you might actually have somebody that says, oh my God, you went to Pacific University. There's three of us here in the committee that went to Pacific University. And, we just love that you're applying and you might relax about it. So never, never, never relax. I mean, be relaxed, in the interview and do your best. But don't get immediately caught in that similarity attraction because it could be an advantage, but it could also be a disadvantage. I've been in search committees. I've been candidate where somebody felt a similar attraction to me as a woman of color, right? And it was like a Latino guy, and then he winked his eye at me, and that was just creepy. It's like, why? He just distracted me. I'm like, why did you do that? Or you don't. Anyway, it was just odd. So be kind of ready for those things. I'm like, ooh, die. It was just weird. Affinity bias, Jean.
Okay, affinity. I guess the guy had an affinity for Narsa too. I don't know. Anyway, so an example here is when you feel a natural affinity towards a candidate or an interviewee. It might be, you might think, and this can go the other way, right? Like you might be in an interview and everyone might be like younger, like maybe your age. So you're going to have like an affinity towards the group, right? Because you're thinking, oh, they're kind of the same age and they seem like they'd be kind of cool. Well, they're doing the same thing to you when you are getting interviewed, right? They're thinking, oh, gee, and this is funny. I just did this last night. I was in a Latinx, Latino, whichever we want to call it today, group. And we were talking about where we're from. And I naturally, and I did this, and I was thinking about this last night, I did the same affinity bias. We all went around and we talked, we introduced ourselves and then we said where we're from. And so I naturally wanted to have an affinity for everybody. So like someone said, oh, well, like I am from Nevada. And I'm like, oh, I used to live in Nevada. And then someone said, oh, I am from Costa Rica. And I'm like, oh, I've been to Costa Rica. And like, I'm sitting there doing the thing. And then I'm like, oh, I am trying to create an affinity bias with all these folks because I've been to these places. And then this is a funny story. What's really funny is the only person that I didn't have an affinity to, she said, oh, I moved here from Michigan. And I'm like, oh, I've never been to Michigan. I've never done anything. And then she said, oh, but I was born in Texas. And I'm like, oh, okay, so was I. So anyway, that happens naturally to us, I think, every day, but just being aware of that when you're in an interview process, that folks are thinking about those things and looking for those things. And again, like Narsa said, when we do this presentation, when y'all are getting chosen for maybe like grad school, we do presentations for the admissions departments to say, hey, like, it's okay to have the bias, but like, don't choose someone because they're from the same state you grew up in, or right, like any of those things. So just be aware of that affinity bias and how it plays out, right? Like in the case that I was talking about last night, well, it was just a way for us to build community, and I wasn't gonna like not hire someone because they're not from the same town. But just keeping that in mind as you go through interviews, because again, what happens a lot of times in organizations is they're trying to like find people that are the same, that they feel comfortable with. And so they're trying to find what we call like the culture fit. And so when folks say, oh, well, yeah, they'll fit our culture. Well, I always try to tell folks when they are doing interviews, it's like, well, sometimes it's okay to be a little bit different than the culture, because now we have another way of thinking of things. And that might play into your interview when you're talking about yourself and how you think about things, and your added benefits of being bilingual or of coming from a different culture, what you can add to that culture that maybe they don't have already. So that's affinity. Zero risk. This one I like. It's often what happens when a search committee or an interview committee does not want to take a chance on something a little bit different than what they're used to. And the example here, and as I talked about, we do this example with admissions, right? Like they might look at a student and say, oh, that student is from Florida, and dang, I don't know if they're going to last here in Oregon. And those of you that are from Oregon, you know what Oregon's like every January to December, and we kind of know what the weather's going to be like, and we all know it rains a lot. So sometimes a search committee or an interview committee may look at those things and think, oh yeah, perhaps that person's not going to be able to survive our weathers here. So another example outside of weather is, and this is where I often just again say, make sure that you give your qualifications. We had a position here at the college that we hired for, and the person was, it was a computer type position. And the person, we had several candidates, and we had many candidates that had computer experience in higher education. But we also had someone who had computer experience, excellent computer experience, but they came from industry, so from a corporation. So thinking about the fact that we need to be able to think outside the box. So again, doing your homework and saying, oh, I'm interviewing for this kind of position and I don't have experience in this, be able to tell how your experience can transfer to this different institution. Being able to do that could be the difference between you getting the job and not getting the job, because sometimes folks don't want to take the chance. That's why it's called zero risk, right? Like they don't want to take a risk on something or something that might not fit into their scheme of what they think is the appropriate person. And conformity. This is one that I'm sure y'all are probably familiar with. This is something that I think about can happen anywhere, including in an interview. But it's when decisions are affected by group peer pressure. So sometimes a person might not say anything because they're afraid of how they might be viewed, or they might be a first generation student that's not used to folks that might be really dominant in a class or in a peer setting. So I always just, this is just one to be aware of. It's really difficult when you have an opinion and it might be different than what everyone else has, and it's hard to say sometimes. So I think in this case, in an interview, you need to make that decision. Like if the organization, and again, doing your homework, right? Like if the organization is an organization that has your values And I'm sure y'all have talked a little bit about that, or you may later in other workshops, but thinking about, well, I don't want to be in a position where I have that minority opinion and I'm going to have to be standing up for myself all the time. So thinking about the organization as a whole, when you're making these decisions about going into whatever type company to get that position. Nessa, did you want to add anything?
No, Jean, I think you did.
Okay.
it.
All right, so then you're up, Nessa.
All right, thank you, Jean. I also wanted to say, if any of you that are doing this via Zoom, participating via Zoom, please make sure you put your questions in chat. And if any of you that are there present with Vanessa, just please let Vanessa know you have a question, and then we can go ahead and stop and answer the question, or any clarification you might want to talk about. So we're going to move now to microaggressions, right? I remember being about most of your age, and we didn't have such word. There was no such word as microaggression. Back then, we just had discrimination and stereotypes, and we're talking 80s, 90s. So the academia has now moved into different words, which are the microaggressions that come up quite a bit. I have daughters that are about, they are here at Pacific University, so this is a common language that they use. But I don't want to assume that we all know what this particular definition is. So we're going to kind of lay the foundation for it for the rest of these presentation. So these microaggressions really can be viewed as an outgrowth of implicit bias. Jean and I have done a lot of presentations, and we had a big aha moment as we were preparing curriculum for other presentations, and thought, wait a minute, these microaggressions is really like an outgrowth of the implicit bias. They're literally like connected at the hip. So came to find out that doing some research that Columbia University, Daryl Wing, Sue defines this term as prejudice, right? So going back, stereotype, prejudice, discrimination, that leaks into many interpersonal situations and decision points that we encounter with each other as human beings. And they can be experienced as slights or insults or indignities and denigrating messages. So some of you might be thinking, yeah, that just happened this morning, or yeah, that happened last week, so forth and so on. So just wanted to lay the foundation for the rest of the presentation about that. So some examples of that can be like when I was working at another college in Oregon with the migrant students. Many times these students would be in tears and would come to my office and say, I'm trying to communicate with my tutor about what's going on, but the best way that I can articulate to get to know the tutor, for example, or the professor, is via a story. Jean and I talk about this all the time because I'm a storyteller. I can't help it. It's in my DNA, it's in my blood. It's how my parents communicated with me. It was via story. So I can't seem to get that out of my system. It's just there. So the student was like, how do I communicate, so the student received a microaggression about this. So we had to, I went ahead and talked to the student and culturally said, I know that's very difficult. How are we going to talk about this? So that's just one particular example. Jean, do you have anything else you want to add to this?
Yeah, I think that we often experience microaggressions, and particularly folks that might be BIPOC. I think that there's a whole other workshop on microaggressions that we're happy to present at a different time, but we go really into depth around how you feel when you receive a microaggression. And I think looking at yourself when you go into an interview and knowing what sets you off, right? Like, because it's intent, what is the intent, and how did I feel about that microaggression? And again, as we talked about earlier, we all have been raised very differently. Myself being a white-facing Latina, sometimes things might be said and it doesn't bother me. And it might be someone else that maybe gets the same microaggression, and it could be very painful. So knowing yourself and knowing what sets you off and what's painful is important when you go into that interview, so that you're prepared if in case a microaggression does happen to you during that interview.
Thank you, Jean. So next, what we have is another small video called Microaggressions. It's a mosquito microaggression. It does have some cursing, so I just want to give you that ahead of time. So I apologize for that ahead of time. So Vanessa, I think Jennifer Teeter sent you the link.
I think we should explore a few solutions.
Grammarly suggestions catch when your tone might undermine your message, and it offers.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem,
Oh, you're so well spoken.
oh, just imagine instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while,
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland.
sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date,
Oh, sure, he was so good.
Excuse me?
going grocery shopping,
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
commuting to work,
So when are you gonna have a baby?
watching TV,
We have to keep the Redskins name. It's part of our culture and history.
or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up
Do you
everywhere.
know John? Give me shopping advice.
So
I
bad.
live here too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every goddamn day,
Touch your hair.
multiple times a
So
day,
pretty. Can I
Can I
touch
touch
your
it?
hair?
Please?
Oh my
Please?
God.
Can I?
is fucking annoying. That makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes, which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares? Just another angry black one.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try this challenging major.
Ow, my dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
It looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
Thank you, Vanessa, for helping us with the technology. So any thoughts really quickly here from anybody about the mosquito microaggression bites? Vanessa, do we have anybody on the floor? No?
Yeah, no hands are raised.
All right. So this actually is a video that we like to show to be able to, again, not assume that, we all know what microaggressions are. I know that I've seen this video many, many times. Some of you might have seen it already. Some of you, it might be the first time, but it can be annoying. And we will talk in a few minutes about what do you do if you are in an interview and a microaggression happens right there at the moment. How do you go about handling that? So Gina's next.
So really quickly, there is sometimes a confusion around microaggression because folks automatically think of micro like in small. But when we think about microaggression, it's not necessarily something that's small. Micro is more on a smaller scale in regards to the number of people that might be affected. That's why we like to bring in this macroaggression definition, and it's a large scale or overt aggression towards those of another race, culture, gender, and etc. So we're talking large scale. And I'll give you an example, and this is often macroaggressions. We think about them in regards to institutions. So in this case, I'll give you an example about, I worked at PCC several years ago, Portland Community College, Rock Creek campus. And we had a policy at the college that the finance department, the accounting, right? Like you go to the little window and you maybe cash a check or pick up your financial aid or whatever the case may be. And the idea was they had just, their policy was that they did not accept cash. They would only accept credit cards and checks. And so we started to have some questions from some of our students, because not all of our students have credit cards and not all of our students have checks. In fact, some students just didn't really trust the system, or in some cases, some students who are documented or undocumented don't necessarily want to have all this information out as they're trying to, or don't have the opportunity to create credit or those kinds of things. And so for those students, it was often difficult because they managed a lot of their finances with cash. And it came to the attention of the college in regards to, a lot of students came together and they ended up going to a board meeting and asking that the policy be adjusted so that, and that could be helpful for anybody, right? Like, what if you forgot to go, you just got your check cashed and you have all this cash and you need to go pay your library fine, right? And you don't have your checking account or you don't have your credit card, right? But you have cash. That'd be kind of annoying if you went to go pay your bill and they wouldn't take cash, right? So that's kind of a smaller scale situation, but the idea is this is a big policy that PCC had. And so the students felt like that needed to be changed. And this was basically an overt aggression towards folks that didn't have the ability to have credit or have checking accounts or credit cards. So it's an example of macro. And again, I like to just say that often folks say micro is small, and it doesn't mean like small in scale, like in the impact that it has on someone, just that is more of a smaller scale in regards to how many people are involved. So we just like to give that example just for context.
I also just want to add overall, as Jean and I are presenting all of this to you, one of the things that I can share that I see on a daily basis, and it's actually happening nationwide, is that use the information that we're providing to you today. You will have access to the PowerPoint presentation, because I can guarantee you that the likelihood of you as a interviewee being asked a question on diversity is going to come up. It's one of the things that we have seen. I was on the search committee for the HR director, and as we were looking at, not necessarily in that particular, I was not part of the search committee, but I was, I still had an opportunity to interview the person more one-on-one. But the reason I bring that up is because as I was doing just research and studying, almost guaranteed every place that's hiring right now will ask you a diversity question. What breaks my heart professionally is when we are interviewing candidates here and they have nailed all the questions, but they cannot answer the diversity question. Or the diversity question, it is so superficial or so insulting, the answer. Where it's like, oh, diversity is just, it's a beautiful thing. Yes, we should celebrate diversity. That's I'm being, giving an answer. And we're all children of God. Everybody should be treated equally. So that type of answer is not what a lot of companies are looking for. Just letting you know about that. So this particular topics that we're sharing also in general about the definition of a microaggression, of macroaggression, implicit bias, explicit bias. If you would get to know particularly what that means, you'll have more of a sophistication to be able to say diversity is not just about diversity. It's about being aware of the implicit, explicit bias. So you have an awareness of that. That is what the world of interviewing looks like at this particular time. So we would not be doing our job at Pacific University if we were to send you out there to interview for jobs and you didn't necessarily at least have the knowledge of this terminology. And I know that you all have it. I'm sure it's being embedded in your classrooms, in everything within Pacific University. But take advantage of that as well, right? Because I have seen people that have graduated from certain, I won't name what institutions of higher ed locally within Oregon. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you paid how many thousands of dollars and you got very little. So I literally will not hire people that cannot answer diversity questions, at least not fake ones. So I know I'm being hardcore, but a lot of the companies are that way at this point. Jean, do you have anything to add about that?
Yeah, I was just going to add that, and what we often do out of our office of equity, diversity, and inclusion is we will often, and like Nasa was saying that she interviewed the HR director, we will often interview candidates that are finalists so that we can give feedback to the departments, because at Pacific, we feel it's really important that we hire folks that do get this EDI stuff. And we can have a conversation with folks and we can get more information from them just by doing that. So we value that here at Pacific. And so often many of the departments around campus will, if they are able, have us interview those folks one-on-one. So as Nasa said, I believe that is certainly the way that things are moving, and for a very good reason. And just to be ready and expecting that. And as Nasi mentioned, like knowing the definitions, knowing what these things are, just creates more of a foundation for your knowledge and for your ability to answer those questions. So be prepared, know that you are going to be asked some sort of an equity question, some sort of a diversity question, and you'll just shine because you'll, again, as we've been saying over and over, do your homework. And that's part of your homework for sure.
So how to respond to a bias or microaggression. So Jean and I will go back and forth with this one. Again, there are different ways to recognize and react to bias and microaggressions, especially during an interview. It may or may not happen, and it all depends on every person. Every person that's being interviewed is what I call it a different spectrum of his or their own identity, whatever that may be, So here are a couple of scenarios that you might get as you're being interviewed. Especially if, and I'm doing a bias here. It might be that the search committee that will interview you might be a lot of baby boomers. I don't know, that would be like Jean and I, baby boomers, or older. They might make a comment, or it may not be a baby boomer. It could be anybody. They might say, oh my God, you are too young to be qualified for this position. How would you respond to that? Or you speak English really well. It isn't necessary for you to give your pronouns here. We don't believe in them. You might get something like that. Will your religion prevent you from doing this job? So Gina and I want to hear from those of you that are participating in this. How would you answer? What would you do in the moment? And then we can just start engaging and see if you feel comfortable. Any of these. Maybe some of you have already received these microaggressions.
Give me 1 second, Narcy.
I feel like in the moment I would kind of respond, but in the long run, I'd be like, if that was asked towards me, it would kind of turn me away from, say I was wanting to have a job at this company and they were asking me those type of questions, and it's something that I don't agree with. It would kind of turn me away a little bit, especially for the one with the pronouns, that's important. And I was going to say nowadays, but it's always been important. But before I came here, I had a job and it's one that I was 17, and normally people that are older normally have this job. And the amount of times that I was told this, I kind of just shrugged it off, but there's not really much you can do.
Cindy, was it Cindy speaking?
Molly.
Molly, thank you for sharing that. You said some very valuable things, is like, you recognize something, and you're not going to talk about that in a little bit, is that maybe the values of this particular company are not aligning with yours, in particular, for example, with the pronouns. So doing your homework and the mission and the vision of that particular institution is one that it's always good to look at before going into a particular job. The other is that you are getting a particular view of the company. Now, depending on how and where you want to go, you could answer the question, like, it isn't necessary for you to give your permission. I mean, excuse me, to give your pronouns here. We don't believe in them. It depends how professionally feisty you want to be that day, professionally. Oh, please tell me more about that. Why is that not important here? Right? Or you might just be so shocked that you're like, oh my gosh, and it might actually block you for the rest of the interview. So I just want to kind of bring those. I've been through many of these right here, and it is not easy to navigate. I think Sara Olvera had a clarification or a question.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Sarah's. Oh,
Go ahead, Sarah.
sir.
Yeah, so it would definitely throw me off, and it's hard to think in the moment how you would respond to any of these questions, but asking for clarification and bringing it back to that interviewer and being like, what do you mean by that? Why aren't pronouns important at this institution or position? I think just asking for more clarification would help. But again, it's difficult once you're in that moment.
Yes, absolutely, Sarah. You're absolutely correct about that. You might want to, you have to be on your toes. You have to be on your toes. Another tactic that I have seen people use and that I have used is that particular scenario, whatever that may be, you could continue through the interview and kind of write it down on the side, or keep it in your mind or whatever. And when it's your turn to ask the question for the committee, because they're always going to ask you, do you have any questions for us? It might be to be expand. You can expand on that particular, like you said, Sara, right at that moment, or you can park it and then ask it when it's your turn to ask questions as well.
Yeah, I like the tactic of always, and again, yeah, I would imagine being in the middle of an interview, it could get pretty startling. But just in general, my tactic is always to, as Sara said, just ask for clarification, ask questions. Well, what did you mean by that? I think I was reading an article the other day around making the invisible visible was one of like the first steps to having this discussion. So like, it's sort of invisible. They said the thing, but like trying to make it more visible, like asking those questions. Or also another comment was like, oh, gee, that seems like a stereotype to me. Like all of the people that are from India that I know speak fine. I don't know why you would think they speak English fine. I don't know why you think that it's better or worse than anybody else, right? Like, so bringing the invisible to visible, like bringing that out and bringing those comments out to folks so that they can see that like you don't necessarily believe what that stereotype is. So again, bringing the invisible to visible.
One of the things also really quickly on bullet number 1, which is, oh my gosh, or oh my goodness, or oh my tree, whatever they might say, you are way too young to be qualified for this position. We actually, Jean and I, get this quite a bit when we are doing this presentation for graduate students, for example, that are going into the medical field of some sort. And the way to respond to that could be, I have received my bachelor's and my master's in this particular area, and then just continue moving on. So try to not personalize it right there in the moment. But again, that's a microaggression. It's a micro that might have come your way, and there's actually they're not fun. Anybody else have any other things that you want to share about this particular situation? Gina and I felt like we needed to say it and bring it up because it does happen. And it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. I certainly remember being at a very young age, and we're talking again back in the 80s, and things like this coming up. And I thought there was something like, what is going on? You know, I don't understand. I remember one particular job I got with a federal program, Willow Whitman National Forest. I went in to do some work there in Baker City, and I was so happy and so proud, and my family was so happy and proud that I had this job as an internship for the summer. And when I was introduced to all of the staff, I was introduced like, this is Narcia Rodriguez. Yay, we met our quota. We hired our Mexican lady, you know, and yay. And I'm like, what? And I didn't know what to do with it. You know, I was like, what? So I don't want you to go through shocking moments like that. You might, but at least prepare yourself psychologically.
Narce, we have Brooklyn who would like to share.
Okay.
I wanted to comment on the fourth bullet point under the scenarios. If someone were bringing up my religion within an interview, it would make me extremely uncomfortable. Not that I'm afraid to share about my religion, but like asking me if it's going to change how I would work or my work ethic or my ability as a student. And then if I were to bring it up and recircle that question at the end, or even right then, I would be nervous that they would use that against me as well. Like saying that's like either arguing or like, why am I questioning their interviewing questions and whatnot. So that would be a really hard one for me to approach.
Absolutely, Brooklyn. One, just so you all know, legally, they cannot ask you that question. Okay, legally, people cannot, if you're being asked that particular question, then there's a message from the company that they may not be following legality themselves. But sometimes they do, sometimes they will ask you that particular, or they will make a comment about it. So, and I validate what you're saying about, you know, what do you do in that particular moment? Because, you know, you don't, you know, you're interviewing for the job. So what do you do with it in that particular moment? It's something that you have to be quickly, you know, you might go into what I called, not you, but, you know, a person might go into what I call an imposter syndrome. That's another presentation, you know, and that would be like, oh my gosh, I want this job so bad that I would say, oh yeah, you know, and you might get into an answer that you're trying to fit in with that company because they're saying, you know, they're asking this religion question, but it's not really you, you know, and is that the place that you are going to want to work?
I think that also often brings in sort of that power dynamic, right? Like the person that's the interviewer at that moment is the one that sort of is holding that power. And this often comes up even just in general, right? Like we do presentations for like students that are doing internships at different locations, and it gets dicey, right? Like maybe you're the person that you're working with at that clinic or wherever the place may be delivers that microaggression. And so as a student, right, like what do you do with that? And there's that power dynamic where that person that is whatever the dentist or whatever they might be is going to give you your grade, right? Like, and if you don't pass this course, then you know, you're maybe not going to be a dental hygienist later or whatever the case may be. So I think just really thinking about all your options and what you can do in the situation and in the long run, right? Like thinking about, well, if you really want to work there and you think, well, you could maybe think, oh, well, maybe it was a one-time thing and it was just this one person that asked the question. But those are decisions that in the end you have to make, and they're never easy for sure.
One particular possible answer you can provide to this, let's say it was the first initial interview, for example, would be something like you were asked, will your religion prevent you from doing this particular job? One diplomatic answer could be, I will assure that I follow policies and procedures in regards to assuring that when I'm doing my job, I'm following procedures and policies for doing this particular job. In particular, if there's a day that I need to take off for any particular policy or procedure that's already set up within HR, for example. If you were to have a second interview about this could be where you can also dig a little bit more, or you don't have to wait also to dig a little bit more. I mean, it doesn't have to be a second interview. You can follow it up later with the search committee chair and say, can you please clarify is in general, so you're not like saying, I'm Jehovah's Witness or Catholic or whatever, but is there a policy or procedure within your institution that would prevent somebody from is religion a situation? I don't know, those are the things that Gina and I can help also help even when, and also Vanessa and her team, where you are, interviewing, let's say it's next month or in May, and this comes up and you're trying to figure out like, how do I answer? How do I follow up? We can help you draft something that would be diplomatically conducive to that company as well. So there's always these policies and procedures that companies need to follow and not violate freedom of religion. Any more questions, Vanessa or others?
Yeah, not at the moment. I think we're okay.
Thank you. Thank you for those of you asking. Those are really good questions. And that's kind of like real life that happens out there. So the next slide, it kind of goes aligned to what we were just talking about and what questions that you asked. Important themes, tips for interviewing. Do your research, right? What is the mission and the vision of the particular company, institution, agency that you're applying for? Most places will have a mission and a vision and values. Are those particular values aligning with your values? If they're off whack, then you might be miserable. I'm telling you from experience. There are many times I didn't do my homework, and it was really difficult to operate in a system. Read and review the company online. Get to know a lot about them. I can tell you that search committees will want you to know a lot about them as much as possible. I don't know about Eugene or Vanessa, when you have a candidate that says, well, there's data, like if you don't know the data about that particular company, I'm gonna like narrow it down, let's say it's specific, because every institution is different. When we have a candidate and they don't even know the data demographics of our students or the numbers, like how many undergraduate students we have and graduate students, and then the demographics of first generation, the majors, just the general stuff that's out there, then I'm like, ooh, you didn't do your homework, So do your homework. It's just like preparing for class. Do you want to make sure that you look at all that? Is there a staff handbook you can read through? You can always ask the HR office. I like to look at the staff handbook. They might call it something different. So you can kind of get to see if their handbook also aligns with the mission and the values that you have. Also keep in mind that an interview should always focus on the job topic, the description, and your skills. So if they start detouring from the job topics or the description, then that's a really difficult thing to navigate. Jean, do you want to add anything more about this?
I guess what I would add is, as Nessa mentioned earlier, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. And so if you've done your homework, you're going to shine in that area, because then you can say, oh, well, I noticed that your mission has equity embedded in it. Can you tell me about what things you're doing to make your institution more inclusive of all students, right? Like, so if you've read that stuff, then you're going to shine at the end when you start asking your questions. So yeah, reading about the organization and being able to ask questions specific to the organization are something that I definitely would encourage folks to do as they're finishing up maybe the interview and it's your turn to start asking some of those questions. And again, like if you asked for that handbook, there should be information, thinking back to the religion question, there should be information on that about like, oh, we offer X days off for whatever needs there might be from someone. So that can always be super helpful.
Next slide. This is our next final slide also. This slide was actually designed not by Gina or I, but by my administrative assistant and also a project manager, but she wasn't able to participate today. That's Jennifer Teeter. And as we were putting this together, she said it would be important to talk about what is a job seeker's power. What can they do to be successful? So, and what do they do once they get the job? So one of the things that Jennifer Teeter said, continue to ask leading questions to figure out if this is really the job for you. And we've already talked about this, right? So you're interviewing them just as much. Also, don't forget to highlight all of your skills when you negotiate. Make sure for those of you that this might be your first professional job after you graduate, or some of you might have already had one, is we are right now in a very competitive market in the world, and particularly in the United States. I can tell you based on doing a lot of interviews here on campus as well. It is very competitive. Negotiate. I have a daughter right now that's currently going through that. She's finishing her master's, and there's a lot of jobs available in the field that she's going into. And she's so excited. She's like, oh yeah, I already got a verbal offer. I'm like, wait, stop. Are you negotiating possibly having them pay part of your loan? How can you negotiate about a moving expense? How can you negotiate? When do you start the job? How can you negotiate if you have a wedding in 2 months after you graduate, after you get the job, and you may not have vacation earned? So those negotiation skills, it might be easy for some of you, but it may not be easy for some others of you as well. So the negotiating is really important. Really be proud of all the skills that you have, all of them. It doesn't matter what they are. You'll be very proud of all those particular skills that you have. The hiring market is changing, and there is power in being at a job. I just talked about that. Seekers, don't forget your interviewing theme. You're interviewing them as much as they are interviewing you. So they're going to be impressed by the questions that you ask also. So, and then just be diplomatic in answering your questions as well. Jean, do you have anything to add here?
I guess I just wanted to add around the skills. Remember, like leadership skills are important to talk about whenever you're having an interview. Your soft skills, like your ability to communicate, your ability to be able to be in relationship with folks and be part of a team. So some of those are like soft skills that maybe folks aren't going to say, well, can you do Microsoft Word? Or, I mean, like, those are like the hard skills, right? Like, or, gee, I know how to balance a finance, whatever spreadsheet or whatever the thing may be, right? Like, so make sure that you also focus on those other pieces and all of those other experiences that you might have had exposure to here at the college and maybe at other positions that you've had.
Thank you, Jean. That's super important. Those soft skills are very, very, very important to talk about, and those leadership skills as well. Those of you that may find yourself in a lead role, You know, it's maybe a leadership role that maybe you have to manage a particular unit. For example, you're applying for a position like that. One thing I just want to remind you of that there's managing and then there's leading. Okay. You manage a project, you manage a thing. You don't manage people, you lead people. So think about that. Also, what type of leader do you want to be when you have that particular role? Leading and managing are two very different things. If a company you're applying for wants you to manage people, then what does that really mean? And you might want to ask more of those questions. That is my bias, you know, is when people say, oh, well, I'm going to manage people. Especially people ask you, what is your leadership style? Really think about that before you go into the interview. You manage projects and you lead people. You know, the humanity of it. So I end with those words, but we still have about 2-3 minutes. If anybody has any thoughts or questions, Jean or Vanessa or others.
Do we have any questions? Doesn't look like we have any questions. Thank you so much, Narce and Jane.
Absolutely. Well, Vanessa, thank you very much for taking us to the next century. You know, Vanessa is a prime example of coming to Pacific University and really taking us to the next level. And actually, this is, from my experience, I've been here at Pacific University, this is the first such event that is able to be so sophisticated in having such conference workshops. Vanessa, you had a vision, and Pacific University decided to go for it. So I want to congratulate you, Vanessa, on the work that you have done, and also working in partnership with so many units within the institution. You're all our future, all of you, and I'm just very proud of every single one of you that is going to be seeking for a job out there once you graduate, and make us proud. I'm already proud of you all going out there. So, and just muchas gracias. And I am grateful that I had an opportunity to share what I know with all of you and also learn from you as well.